Before a single sword was raised against the Valois crown, a far more dangerous blow had already landed. It came without blood, without banners, and without war cries. It came quietly through ledgers' alliances and unanswered commands. By the time Paris sensed the threat, it was already standing inside the kingdom itself. France at this moment was still breathing, but only just. The great victories of the past had not healed the land. They had only delayed the reckoning. Villages rebuilt with weaker walls, armies marched with thinner ranks. The crown remained, but its authority no longer filled the room when it spoke. The Valois kings ruled a country exhausted by a century of survival. War had trained the people to endure, but it had also trained them to doubt. Taxes felt endless. Promises felt temporary. Loyalty became a question rather than a duty. Power drifted away from the throne not through rebellion, but through neglect. Paris tried to govern a nation it could no longer fully reach. Orders traveled slowly and returned incomplete. Local lords interpreted commands in ways that suited them best. The crown needed allies more than it needed subjects, and allies always demand a price. That price was paid to Burgundy. At first, Burgundy appeared as it always had, a prosperous duchy, a pillar of support within the Valois world. Its dukes spoke the language of loyalty and family. Yet while the crown struggled to pay soldiers, Burgundy invested in trade. While France borrowed, Burgundy accumulated. Roads, ports, and cities answered not to Paris, but to a growing administrative machine of its own. This was not defiance, it was preparation. Burgundy did not challenge the Valois throne. It made itself indispensable. Armies waited for Burgundian funding. Diplomacy leaned on Burgundian connections. Each agreement tightened the web. Each compromise weakened the crown just a little more. By the time Paris realized what was happening, Burgundy was no longer a subject that could be commanded. It was a power that had to be negotiated with. This episode is the story of how a kingdom still wearing a crown began to lose control of its future, and how Burgundy rose not as an enemy from outside, but as a force growing from within. If you want to follow how this quiet rise will reshape France and decide the fate of Europe, subscribe to the channel and continue the journey with us. Power is not always born on a battlefield. Sometimes it is born in counting houses in port cities and in quiet rooms where contracts are signed instead of oaths. While the Valois court struggled to hold together what remained, Burgundy was doing something far more dangerous. It was building a state that no longer needed permission. Burgundy was not a single block of land, but a chain of territories stretching across some of the richest regions in Western Europe. From Dijon to Flanders, its influence touched fertile fields, busy workshops, and the most active trade routes of the age. Wool cloth, salt, and silver moved through Burgundian lands like blood through veins. Whoever controlled these routes controlled the rhythm of commerce itself. Unlike Paris, Burgundy understood that wealth was power before armies ever marched. Cities such as Bruges, Ghent, and later Antwerp became engines of prosperity. Merchants found protection, stability, and predictable rule under Burgundian authority. In return, the dukes gained something the Valois increasingly lacked: reliable revenue. With money came independence. Burgundy did not wait for royal levies to raise troops. It paid soldiers directly. It invested in artillery, modern fortifications, and disciplined forces that answered to ducal command alone. These armies were not assembled in desperation. They were maintained in readiness. Diplomacy followed the same pattern. Burgundy spoke to England, to the Empire, and to Italian states as an equal. Marriages were arranged not to serve France, but to surround it. Treaties were signed that placed Burgundy at the center of European negotiation. It no longer acted as a French vassal with foreign ties. It acted as a power with France as only one factor among many. Most dangerous of all was identity. Burgundy began to see itself not as part of the French realm, but as something distinct. Court culture reflected this shift. Art, music, ceremony, and law all reinforced the idea of a Burgundian world refined, wealthy, and orderly. Loyalty flowed upward to the duke, not outward to a distant crown. The Valois kings watched this rise with unease but little ability to stop it. Burgundy still spoke the language of cooperation. It still wore the appearance of kinship. Yet beneath the surface, a rival system had already taken shape. This was not rebellion. It was replacement. A crown depends on obedience. Burgundy was learning how to rule without asking for it. By the time conflict became unavoidable, the balance had already shifted. France faced not a disloyal subject, but a neighbor in all but name. And this was only the beginning. The meeting at the bridge was meant to end a war that had already hollowed out France from within. It was arranged as a gesture of necessity, not trust. Two sides that no longer believed in unity agreed to stand face to face because the kingdom was bleeding too fast to continue tearing itself apart. The Dauphin came carrying the weight of a broken crown. Burgundy arrived with the confidence of a power that no longer needed permission. At the center of this fragile moment stood John the Fearless. He was not merely a duke, he was the most feared political figure in France, son of Philip the Bold. He had inherited one of the richest territories in Europe and turned it into a disciplined machine of money, soldiers, and influence. While the Valois court drowned in indecision, John acted. While the king drifted between clarity and madness, John ruled Paris through loyalty and fear. To many, he felt more present than the crown itself. John had already crossed lines that could never be erased. Years earlier, he had ordered the assassination of Louis of Orléans, cousin to the king, and defended it publicly as an act of necessity. In doing so, he taught France a brutal lesson. Power no longer hid behind ceremony. It killed openly, then justified itself. From that moment, the kingdom split into hostile camps, Armagnacs against Burgundians, brothers against brothers, cities against their own streets. Yet John believed he could still control the future. He agreed to the meeting at Montereau, convinced that fear and leverage would protect him. He arrived armed but calm. To him, reconciliation was not submission, it was strategy. Burgundy did not bow. Burgundy negotiated. The bridge itself became a symbol heavy with tension, narrow, enclosed, watched by armed men on both sides. Words were exchanged that carried years of accusation. Promises of peace clashed with memories of blood. Trust did not exist. Only calculation remained. Then the moment shattered. In the space of a breath, steel was drawn. John the Fearless fell beneath the blows meant to end his influence forever. His blood spilled onto the wood where peace had been promised. The bridge did not unite France. It divided it beyond repair. This was not a murder born of chaos. It was a decision. With John dead, the Dauphin and his advisors believed they had removed the greatest threat to the Valois crown. Instead, they created something far worse. They transformed Burgundy from a rival into an enemy without limits. The shock echoed instantly. Burgundy did not seek compromise. It sought vengeance. The son of the murdered Duke, Philip the Good, would never forget the image of his father dying under the banner of negotiation. From that day forward, Burgundy would no longer see itself as part of France struggling for survival. It would act as a power standing above it. At Montereau, a man was killed, but what truly died was the last chance for internal peace. Burgundy did not turn back. It stepped onto a path that would redraw alliances, invite foreign powers into French soil, and decide the fate of Europe for generations to come. Philip the Good did not rise through fire and steel. He rose through patience, calculation, and an understanding of power that went far beyond the battlefield. Where others sought victory through charges and sieges, Philip chose something quieter and far more enduring: influence. He inherited Burgundy at a moment of raw grief and dangerous opportunity. His father was dead, murdered under the pretense of peace, and the blood of Montereau had hardened Philip's view of the Valois forever. But unlike those who answered betrayal with rage, Philip answered with architecture. He began building a structure of power so dense and interconnected that it no longer depended on open war to dominate events. Burgundy under Philip became a court before it was an army. He gathered nobles not through fear, but through reward. Titles were granted strategically. Lands were exchanged like chess pieces. Loyalty was not demanded. It was purchased, cultivated, and reinforced through constant advantage. Those who entered Philip's orbit found themselves wealthier, safer, and more relevant than those who remained tied to a weakening French crown. Marriage became one of his most effective tools. Alliances were sealed not with oaths alone, but with bloodlines. Each union extended Burgundy's reach into another court, another city, another corridor of influence. Over time, Burgundy ceased to feel like a duchy. It felt like a network, a living system that touched the empire, the Low Countries, and the fractured heart of France. Gold flowed through this system like lifeblood. Burgundy controlled some of the richest commercial centers in Europe. Trade routes, markets, and workshops filled Philip's coffers without the need for constant conquest. This wealth funded art, diplomacy, and intelligence. Spies did not skulk in shadows. They dined at tables, listened in halls, and carried information disguised as conversation. Philip often knew decisions before they were announced. While Valois kings struggled to command obedience, Philip made himself indispensable. He offered protection to some, pressure to others, and opportunity to all who understood the direction of history. Burgundy became a place where disputes were settled, favors were traded, and futures were decided. Swords still existed, but they were no longer the primary language of power. Philip also understood symbolism. He transformed his court into a stage of legitimacy and prestige. Ceremonies were lavish. Orders of chivalry reinforced loyalty and identity. Burgundy did not challenge the French crown directly. It overshadowed it, slowly, subtly, irresistibly. What made Philip truly dangerous was restraint. He did not rush to destroy his enemies. He waited until they depended on him. By the time they realized the balance had shifted, resistance felt impossible. Valois authority eroded not through rebellion, but through irrelevance. This was a new kind of domination, one where borders mattered less than influence, and where decisions made in Burgundy echoed across Europe without a single battle being fought. By the time France looked up from its wounds, it was no longer facing a rival duke. It was facing a system, and at its center sat Philip the Good, calm, patient, and already several moves ahead. While Burgundy refined its power with calm precision, the Valois court began to rot from the inside. There was no single explosion, no open rebellion that announced the collapse. Instead, the damage spread quietly, carried by suspicion, wounded pride, and ambition left unchecked. The French princes no longer looked to the crown as a source of unity. They looked at one another as rivals, Every decision from Paris was questioned. Every command was measured against personal gain. Obedience became conditional, delayed, or quietly ignored. Orders arrived at provincial courts only to be discussed, softened, or forgotten entirely. The king still wore the crown, but his voice no longer carried the weight it once had. Trust evaporated. Advisors whispered against one another. Councils became arenas of silent hostility rather than places of strategy. Alliances inside the kingdom shifted constantly, not to defend France, but to outmaneuver competing factions. Each prince feared that strength shown by another would come at his own expense. As a result, no one acted decisively. In moments when unity was essential, hesitation ruled. The most dangerous fractures were not loud. They appeared as polite refusals, delayed reinforcements, and calculated absences. A lord might pledge loyalty in public, then fail to arrive when summoned. Another might raise troops, only to station them far from danger. On parchment, the kingdom still looked whole. In reality, it was splintered into competing centers of power, each pulling away from the throne. The royal treasury suffered alongside royal authority. Taxes were resisted, revenues were redirected. Funds meant for defense vanished into private fortifications and personal guards. The crown was forced to negotiate with its own nobles for resources that once belonged to it by right. Each negotiation weakened the idea of central rule further. What made the situation truly fatal was that this erosion felt normal. No single act seemed treasonous enough to provoke decisive punishment. Each act of defiance could be justified, each delay explained. Over time, the abnormal became routine. The crown adjusted downward, accepting less obedience, less control, less respect. Meanwhile, Burgundy watched. It did not need to strike. Valois power was dismantling itself. Every internal quarrel saved Burgundy the cost of war. Every divided council strengthened the perception that France was no longer governed by a single will. By the time danger became undeniable, the damage was already structural. Valois was not falling because it was defeated. It was falling because it could no longer act as one kingdom. And in that paralysis, Burgundy found its greatest advantage. Burgundy no longer behaved like a subject caught between loyalty and rebellion. It acted like a power that understood its position at the center of the board. To the west stood England, hungry for advantage. To the south stood the Valois crown, weakened and divided. Burgundy stood between them not as a shield, but as a gate that could be opened or closed at will. When England offered trade privileges and recognition, Burgundy listened. When Valois promised concessions and titles, Burgundy listened again. There was no contradiction in this behavior, because Burgundy no longer believed in permanent allegiance. It believed in timing. Every alliance was temporary. Every oath was conditional. What mattered was not who ruled France, but who needed Burgundy the most at any given moment. This flexibility gave Burgundy immense leverage. English armies could not move freely without Burgundian cooperation. French campaigns stalled when Burgundy refused support. Roads, supply lines, and key cities lay under Burgundian influence. A single decision from its court could slow an invasion or accelerate it. Burgundy did not need to fight battles to shape outcomes. It simply chose when not to intervene. To England, Burgundy was a gateway into the heart of France. To Valois, Burgundy was both a necessary partner and a constant threat. This dual role allowed Burgundy to extract concessions from both sides. Trade expanded. Wealth flowed into its cities. Its court grew richer, more cultured, and more confident. While others spent gold on war, Burgundy spent it on influence. The most unsettling aspect for Valois was unpredictability. Burgundy did not announce betrayal. It adjusted. One season it stood beside English banners. Another season it withdrew just enough to let France struggle alone. These shifts were never explained as ideology or vengeance. They were explained as necessity, as balance, as prudence. For the French crown, this was devastating. Strategy depends on certainty. Burgundy removed that certainty. Every plan had to account for Burgundian reaction. Every campaign risked collapse if Burgundy changed its stance. Even victory felt fragile because it could be undone by a single diplomatic turn. Over time, the war itself began to orbit Burgundy. Not because Burgundy sought control openly, but because both England and France reacted to its choices. When Burgundy leaned toward England, the Valois position weakened. When Burgundy pulled back, England hesitated. The conflict no longer moved only by armies, but by conversations held behind closed doors in Burgundian halls. This was a new kind of power in medieval Europe. Not the power of crowns or bloodlines, but the power of position. Burgundy understood geography, economics, and timing better than either empire locked in open war. It did not seek to replace them. It sought to outlast them. And as the war dragged on, the most dangerous question for France was no longer how to defeat England. It was how to survive a future where Burgundy decided that France itself was no longer essential. Burgundy never placed a crown upon its own head. It never declared a king of France. It never marched on Paris to claim the throne. And yet again and again, history bent around its decisions. This was power without ceremony, authority without coronation, a kingmaker who ruled from the shadows. While Valois struggled to hold legitimacy and England fought to impose it, Burgundy mastered something more dangerous: influence. Its dukes understood that a crown attracts enemies, but leverage attracts dependence. By refusing the throne, Burgundy avoided the burden of rule while enjoying the privilege of choice. It could lift a rival or let him fall simply by stepping aside. Courts across Europe watched Burgundy carefully. Envoys arrived not to demand obedience, but to seek favor. Marriages were negotiated not for love, but for alignment. Trade routes were redirected. Alliances were delayed or accelerated. Burgundy did not shout commands. It waited, and in waiting, it forced others to move first. This quiet dominance reshaped the conflict itself. The war between England and France was no longer only a struggle of armies and claims. It became a test of who could read Burgundy better, who could predict its next move, who could offer enough without surrendering too much. Many failed. Some learned too late that Burgundy never promised permanence. For Valois, the realization was bitter. The greatest threat to the crown was no longer only English steel. It was the fragmentation that had allowed Burgundy to rise so high. Every feud, every assassination, every broken oath among French princes had widened the space Burgundy stepped into. The monster was not born in isolation. It was assembled piece by royal weakness. For England, the lesson was equally harsh. Burgundy was an ally only as long as it was useful. The moment England overreached or weakened, Burgundy adjusted its stance. Loyalty was never owed. Only advantage was respected. By the end of this chapter, Burgundy stood as a mirror to the age itself, a realm proving that power no longer belonged solely to those who wore crowns. It belonged to those who controlled movement, money, and momentum, those who could shape outcomes without claiming credit. The tragedy is not that Burgundy became so strong. The tragedy is that the princes around it made that strength possible. In fighting for fragments of power, they created something far greater than any one of them: a force that did not need to rule openly because it already ruled the game. And as this episode closes, the unease remains. When kings are divided, when crowns are fragile, when loyalty is negotiable, something else always rises to fill the void. Burgundy was that something. Not a kingdom of destiny, but a consequence of broken princes. If you want to continue this journey through the shadows of power betrayals and forgotten forces that shaped Europe, remember to follow the series and subscribe to the channel. The story of Valois is far from over, and the most dangerous chapters are still ahead.